Why the world feels close to a wider war. There are moments in history when people feel the ground shifting beneath them, not because a war has already begun, but because the signs are familiar. Rising tensions, hardened alliances, conflicts that overlap instead of ending, weapons becoming more precise yet more destructive, language growing harsher while restraint grows weaker. Today, many ordinary people feel something unsettling. The sense that the world is drifting closer to a wider war, not by intention, but by momentum. History teaches us that this feeling usually appears before catastrophe, not after it. And history teaches something else, something even more important. War without limits does not produce victory, it produces extermination. This is why the modern world created what we now call the laws of war, most clearly expressed after the great catastrophes of the 20th century, especially through the framework commonly known as the Geneva Conventions. These rules were not written by idealists. They were written by survivors. They exist because humanity learned, painfully, that if war has no limits, civilization itself does not survive. What follows are the 10 unbreakable rules of war, explained not as legal text, but as human stories. Rule 1. Civilians must never be targeted. Civilians must never be deliberately attacked, because once civilians become targets, war stops being conflict and becomes extermination. Historical story. Major European and Asian cities. Mid-20th century. At night, families descended into basements and tunnels. Children slept in subway stations. Cities burned not because armies were there, but because people were. The strategy was simple. Break the population to break the state. But the populations did not break. They endured. When the wars ended, historians counted the dead and found something disturbing. The wars did not end faster. They only killed more civilians. What happens when the rule is broken? Civilian deaths radicalize survivors. Refugee crises destabilize entire regions. Hatred outlives the war itself. Why this rule is unbreakable? Because targeting civilians creates future enemies faster than it creates peace. Even the side that wins inherits generations of resentment. Rule 2. Fighters must be distinguishable from civilians. Those who fight must be clearly identifiable as fighters, because when fighters disappear into civilian life, civilians become battlefields. Historical story. Southeast Asia, late 20th century. By day, villages were quiet. By night, armed men appeared. Soldiers could no longer tell who was a civilian and who was a combatant. Fear replaced certainty. Mistakes followed. Each mistake pushed civilians toward resistance. What happens when the rule is broken? Civilians are harmed by suspicion. Entire communities become hostile. War spreads instead of ends. Why this rule is unbreakable? Because indistinction turns every human into a potential target, and war becomes endless. Rule 3. Only military targets may be attacked. Only objects that directly contribute to military action may be attacked, because destroying civilian systems destroys societies, not armies. Historical story. Middle East. Late 20th century. Power stations fell. Water systems collapsed. Hospitals went dark. The fighting ended quickly. The suffering did not. Children died years later, not from bullets, but from disease. What happens when the rule is broken? Long-term humanitarian collapse. Failed states. Endless recovery that never truly recovers. Why this rule is unbreakable? Because wars end, but broken societies create new wars. Rule 4. Proportionality must always be respected. The harm caused must never outweigh the military advantage gained, because overwhelming force often wins battles and loses peace. Historical story. North Africa, mid-20th century. Cities were sealed. Force was decisive. Resistance collapsed, briefly. Then the population turned. Years later, independence came anyway, but through blood. What happens when the rule is broken? Violence escalates. Neutral populations radicalize. Wars last longer. Why this rule is unbreakable? Because excessive force creates enemies faster than it destroys them. Rule 5. Prisoners of war must be treated humanely. Captured fighters must be protected, not punished, because surrender saves lives on both sides. Historical story, Pacific Theater, World War II. Prisoners were beaten, starved, executed. Word spread quickly. Surrender means death. Battles turned into fights to the last man. What happens when the rule is broken? Soldiers stop surrendering. Casualties skyrocket. Wars become far more brutal. Why this rule is unbreakable? Because humane treatment shortens wars, cruelty prolongs them. Rule 6. The wounded and medical personnel must be protected. Doctors, nurses, and the wounded are not targets, because without medicine, survival collapses. Historical story. Modern urban war zones. Early 21st century. Hospitals moved underground. Ambulances became targets. Deaths multiplied without gunfire. What happens when the rule is broken? Preventable deaths soar. Epidemics spread. Entire generations suffer. Why this rule is unbreakable? Because attacking medicine turns war into mass death by neglect. Rule 7. Certain weapons are forbidden forever. Weapons that cause uncontrollable suffering must never be used, because some weapons escape human control. Historical story. Western Front, World War I. Gas drifted into trenches. It burned lungs and blinded survivors. Men lived, but never healed. What happens when the rule is broken? Uncontrollable escalation, environmental damage, global retaliation. Why this rule is unbreakable? Because normalization of such weapons threatens humanity itself. Rule 8. Torture is always illegal. Torture is forbidden under all circumstances, because torture destroys truth and legitimacy. Historical story. Colonial conflicts, mid-20th century. Pain produced answers quickly. They were wrong. False intelligence led to false raids. Violence multiplied. What happens when the rule is broken? Intelligence becomes unreliable. Resistance strengthens. States lose moral authority. Why this rule is unbreakable? Because torture weakens the very society using it. Rule 9. Collective punishment is forbidden. Entire populations cannot be punished for individual acts, because collective punishment guarantees endless war. Historical story. One why this rule is Rule 10. War crimes must always be investigated and punished. There must be accountability even after war ends, because rules without consequences are meaningless. Historical story. Post-war Europe, after World War II. For the first time, leaders were told, following orders is not a defense. History changed. What happens when the rule is broken? Atrocities repeat, violence normalizes, law collapses. Why this rule is unbreakable? Because accountability is the final barrier against barbarism. Why these rules are under strain today? Urban warfare, drones, proxy wars, and cyber conflict blur responsibility. Ambiguity becomes a weapon. History shows what follows. Escalation. When accountability fades, restraint disappears. Why war should never begin. These rules exist to protect humanity, not armies. They were written because humanity learned that unlimited war destroys everyone, including the victor. And this leaves one final question. If every war eventually ends but the damage lasts forever, why would humanity choose the one path that guarantees its own destruction?